Hello again. In today's episode, we'll be looking at a few spline control tricks, adding instances and showing how we can raycast those instances to deformed geometry, and I'm also going to give you the scene files for you to have a play with yourself. Let's begin by taking a look at the model. We'll begin with this rail. It's about 50 meters in length. It doesn't really matter how long it is for this demo, so long as you have lots of segments. That's the most important thing. And we'll look at rigging it in a second. Next up is the support. Now this is 1 meter in height, which will be important for later because we're going to be stretching this. And we also need to make sure the origin is in the correct position. You'll notice I've given it a little bit of a triangular shape here for reasons that will become apparent later. We have the base, which will go at the bottom of each support. Doesn't matter about the size too much for this one. Now we also have a mat object, I'm calling that. It's just a flat plane. It marries up to the length of the rail, but just a little bit wider. Now we'll go into this in more detail later. Next up is a building. Now this is just a box which we'll be stretching. This is again just for demo purposes. And finally the obligatory flat ground plane. I'm going to be using LightWave's native spline control, which sadly in this case means using bones, and lots of them. I wish there was another way around it, but there isn't. Having said that, it's definitely worth looking at DB&W's spline toolkit along with the DP spline deformer, I think it's called. But for now, bones it is. We could easily rig this in layout, but I think there's a quick enough technique to do in Modeler, which I'm going to show. So let's select the first 2 points. Right arrow key to select the remaining points along this edge, and Control P to create a spline. There it is in the menu. There it is selected. We'll cut it to detach it from its points and then paste, and it should still be selected. If it isn't, press W and select curve there. Press F3, rest on axis on the Z. Now let's pop over to the Setup tab. Now where it says more, we shall select Convert Slelegons. The curve is still selected, so delete that. Let's change the sketch color to something we can see. Let's go for that grey there. There they are in wireframe mode. So we now have our Slelegons married up with each part of this rail, so that's good. Let's build us a landscape. Okay, so I've loaded all the elements. Here we are in the scene editor here. I'm going to switch that to sequence view just because I get a better feel for what's going on. We're going to create the spline first, so just to keep everything nice and clear and concise, I'm just going to select this lot and turn them off so we can't see anything. Let's create a null and we'll call it node. I forgot to give it an item shape, so let's add one of those. A 2 meter ball I think is fine here. Okay there. Under the items tab, I'm going to hit the array option. We'll clone this 6 times down the Z axis and something like 20 meters apart, something like that. Actually, I'll make this 4. And then we're going to group the clones on a null and OK that. So there's the result of that. I'm going to select the parent null. Let's call that spline. And the OCD in me just wants to zero that out. Obviously, you don't need to do that, I don't think. But I am going to lock this spline, so we can't select that in the viewport. And I'm also going to change these colors. So this spline is not a spline yet, they're just a series of nulls. So the next step is to make these an active spline. So we might as well do that with our rail. We'll select that and unhide it. Let's select wireframe. Let's go over to the Setup tab and we will convert Slelegons. And with a brief pause, here are our bones. We need to select all these bones, select this first bone here and right mouse click on it, which should select all the others. Or we could just go and press our object, go to items and under select all bones of current object that way. Now they're all selected, press M for motion options. These bones need spline control adding to them, which is this option here. Now if we click on this, you'll see, oh, massive headache of bones there. So if you know the name of your spline, you could just type in spline as the top of the list here. And there it is, they will all jump. But another way of doing it, let's clear that. Making sure we're still in sequence view. If we take this spline and move it to the top of the pile. Now if we select all bones, Under the spline control option, you will see that the spline is now at the top of the list. So there's a quite handy thing to know. It looks a bit of a mess at the moment, and for some reason it's shut off the screen here, but we've got a couple of other steps before we tidy that up. Now with these bones still selected, we're going to jump over to controllers and limits, and under Spline Fit, we're going to select Fit to Spline. And while these bones are still selected, let's right mouse click on the monorail object, and then we'll go to Selection, Highlight Viewport Selection, and that'll take whatever's selected in layout into the scene editor, and we're just going to turn off those bones like that. And again, while they're highlighted, I'm going to lock them as well. So now when we close this down and select it, everything is hidden. I'm going to lock our monorail. So what did that Fit to Spline option do? If I take this end null and move it around, you'll notice that the whole rail stretches to the length of the spline. That's why this rail needs lots of segments. So I could duplicate this null here and extend it, and our rail will follow nicely. It's handy to have these headings pointing in the direction of the path. So a quick way to do that is bring up the motion options. Under rotation heading, we'll select spline control, and everything should kind of move to the correct position. And then to save a bit of processing time, let's just press enter, set a keyframe there, and then remove that spline control. So that's set up nicely. Let's create the ground displacement quickly. So let's turn that on. P for properties, we're going to use nodal displacement and displace along the Y axis. We'll keep this simple. So I'm going to just go for a procedural and a make vector. I'm going to take the value into the Y because I'm just going to displace up and down. While we're here, I'm going to add a controller for this ground plane. And the reason for that is I find raycasting much more stable when moving objects around at a displacement level. We'll create a null. Let's call it ground control. Let's give it a selectable shape. With the ground plane selected, let's add another nodal displacement modifier. This is added to the bottom of the stack. We'll quickly call this moves. And we'll move it to the top of the stack. I'm going to use the native displacement here. So I'm going to set the mode under the displacement mode to set. Let's go for a transform. And plug that into there, and then an item info. Point this to our control null, ground control. I'm going to take the position, the rotation, and go, and the stretch, which is in fact scale. And I'm pretty sure I can leave everything else at its default. So if I now select the ground control, I can rotate, move, and scale all at the displacement level. So that's great. That's all done and rigged. Let's lock the ground plane and move on. A little bit of housekeeping first. I'm going to select the support and the base, and I'm going to group these to a null. And I'm going to call this instanced. No collections here, I'm afraid. So I'm going to turn these off from the renderer, and I'm going to lock them. I'm going to do the same for the building as well. Let's add the supports. Now there are a couple of alternative methods to this. The first one deals with applying directly to the spline itself. So we'll select the spline, press P for properties, and add an instance generator. So here it is, and under add object, obviously we want that support. Click on that, and let's give it 60 instances distributed along that spline. And here we are. Let's just make them a little bit bigger so we can just see what's going on. Now what I want is these supports to go straight into the ground without any turns. So for instance, if I select this node here, you can see the support is bending with this node. So what you could do is you could come over to the rotation and you could hit none. The trouble with doing this, and it's one of the reasons I gave these supports a little triangular look, is that we lose the heading detail. So they are actually just pointing in the one direction. Now if your supports are circular, that's fine, go with it. But in case you don't want that, I'm going to show you another method. So let's remove this instance generator from this spline. Create a new null and let's call it path, pointing down the Z of a pyramid. Okay. There it is, just about viewable. Press M for motion options and we're going to map that to our spline. So spline control will be our spline at the top of the list there. I'm going to get frame 100, doesn't matter too much how many frames, just make sure there's a few. And I'm just going to move the Z handle until we eyeball the end of our spline control. It's pretty much all we need for that, so I'm just going to lock it for now. We're basically going to be using this path as a spline. So we'll press P for properties, pop over to the instancer tab and add an instance generator. Add object is our support and our type will be motion path. When we scrub the timeline, you'll see there they are trailing behind. Obviously we don't want that, or they might make quite an interesting animation. So I'm going to untick lock motion to time and follow motion object. And what that now gives us is a nice static row of supports. Now we can change the separation. Next step is to remove the rotations on these supports. And the way to do that is make sure our path null is selected, which is this one here that's moving. Press M for motion options. Where it says spline control for each of these rotations, we're going to change these to keyframes. And as you can see, the rotations have been pretty much zeroed out, but I still want these triangular supports to point in the right direction. So I am going to keep spline control on the heading. So that's all heading in the correct direction. And just to make sure, we will go over to the stretch. Let's just stretch it by some arbitrary amount. And it looks like it's gone a bit wonky because I've missed out the pitch controller. There we go. We'll close this down and we'll set this stretch back to 0. If you're having trouble with these rotations, make sure under rotation the alignment is set to motion item and not path. So at last we've got to the raycasting bit. The raycasting will be attached to the stretching. And I've mentioned in previous tutorials that no stretch is 0%, minus 100 is, well, it's basically flat. So bear that in mind because we've got some remapping to do shortly. And also the mode will need to be uniform. Moving over to the node tab, let's use some nodes, and this is thankfully quite a simple setup. We'll go for a raycaster. This one here, raycast geometry. Now we're going to take the base position of each of these instances and we're going to use that as our ray origin. So plug that in there. Double click on this. We'll be projecting to the ground plane, so we'll tick that there. And we're going downwards, which is -y, which it handily defaults to. Now if we take the clipped ray into the stretch, you notice things go a little bit wonky. Now I'm assuming that's because my support is heading in a negative direction. So let's sort this out. Firstly, I don't want any stretching on the X and Z, only on the Y. So I'm going to separate that out. Let's get a vector scaler. So clip ray into that and we'll take the Y. And then we're going to make vector. The Y into the Y. 0 and 0 is correct if you remember, and then that into the stretch. And we still have this in the opposite direction. So let's quickly fix that. So I'm going to take a multiply node and multiply it by -1. So that's looking pretty good, but you'll notice things are sticking out from underneath the ground here because we still have a little bit of remapping to do, which is simple enough. So let's grab a remap node. We're going to keep the min-max 0 to 1, but we're going to remap those ranges from -1 to 0. Let's give it ground object and make it double-sided so we can see nothing's poking through, which it isn't. So success, excellent. So if we now move these nodes around, everything sticks to the ground. So the next step is to get some feet on the base of these supports, also marrying up to the ground, and that is quite a simple process. Select our path, right mouse click and copy. Let's add another instance generator and right mouse click paste into. It's a bit of a strange workflow, but it works. Let's set this description for this. Let's just call it feet. Double click on that. We're going to replace the support with the feet, so let's do that. So replace object with base, they're called, and they're going to stretch currently, and we don't want that. Before we go into the nodes though, offset, we want to change the mode from random to uniform. And then moving over to the nodes, everything is pretty much set up. We don't need this multiplication or the remapping. All we're going to do is take the Y from the clip ray into the Y, take it out of the stretched into the offset, and it's as simple as that. In fact, let's make the ground texture a little bit more aggressive just to demonstrate that even more. Perhaps pump that up. You may need to nudge the timeline when you make the changes to the ground, or perhaps turn on Studio Live. There you go, that works. It's also worth mentioning for these feet, if we want those a bit fatter, rather than going to modeler, we could select world coordinates, select our feet, or base as they're called, and just scale along the X and Z. Finally, the buildings. Now this is where our matte object comes into play. We'll turn that on. We can't actually see it because it's under there. But not to worry about that, because I'm going to select the bones option and press P, and I'm going to use the bones from the rail object here. So all I'm going to do is select rail, and they should nicely jump into place. Now I won't want this to render, so I'm just going to turn it off like that from the renderer. Perhaps front facing wireframe just for reference. Also for this mat, let's remove all those except the bones. I've added a morph. Let's go to morph mixer and move it above the bones. Obviously do this how you want to do it, but I've got a width that will just expand that. So I've got control over the width, and that will make more sense in a minute. And don't worry about that bit. I'm going to add buildings to the ground, so I'm going to select the ground, press P, and another instance generator. Object is the building, there it is, and we want this on the surface. And there's that one solitary little building. Let's just plonk in 600 for now and make it random of whatever works. Something like that is okay. Distribution, let's relax it slightly so there's a bit of spacing between them. And perhaps we can stretch randomly as well. Now the idea is to take this matte object, which is kind of why I called it matte, to cut a hole through the landscape. And again, we're going to use the raycasting. Over to the nodes tab and use nodes. Let's get that raycaster again. So as before, we're going to get the base position as the ray origin. Now we're on a ground plane object here, and we're going to be projecting upwards. So we're going to select our matte as the object to raycast. And because we're going up and not down, we want a positive Y. So +1. Now there's nothing special about this. All I'm going to do is take the distance and plug it into the weight. So if you wanted to plant some trees underneath this track, that's one way of doing it. But we want buildings, so I'm just going to invert this. So if we now move these nodes around, now in this case we may need to nudge the timeline. I don't think Studio Live works in this instant. Oh, it does. Now if we go back to the matte object, perhaps we don't want so much space, perhaps we want more space. So everything is following along nicely. This wouldn't be LightWave without mentioning a couple of limitations. Let's begin with this path. Now there's no way to calculate the length of this spline, unfortunately. So if this spline gets longer, you're going to have to estimate the end point. So you could either do that grabbing the handle along the Z, or you could just go into the graph editor if that's causing you problems and extend that way. Now the second issue, on this path we've got two instance generators and they basically have the same settings. Anything with an envelope icon next to it, obviously we can tie it together with sliders or expressions or other null items, for instance. The only place this is a problem is with this instance count here. So there's no way to tie that together. So it'll be a case of having to go in and changing that accordingly. And finally, on this ground plane, if you remember, I had this node set up here. Now it appears that this raycast geometry node doesn't work too well in the service editor, so let's copy that and bring up a new window. We'll turn off the instance generator so we don't see the buildings, and we'll shift click on the surface. Let's paste that raycast in. Also go for an instance info, so we're going to take the position into this. Now I've got a test buffer here, so let's take the invert into the test buffer. And there's absolutely nothing. Just check the settings. Let's try gradient just out of interest. So I'm taking the distance into the gradient and then outputting a black and white value. See, I can't get anything out of that. I'm not quite sure why I'm seeing the instances at all here. Should we try world position? Oh, okay, so world position might be of use to somebody. Okay, we are getting something, but I'm not sure, as I say, why we're getting the instances. And clicking these objects on and off isn't making a lot of difference either. So my suggestion is just to delete it, and we'll work out another method at another time. Ended on a bit of a downer there. So there you go, a bit of a chunky one this one, but hopefully lots to digest. Well done for making it this far.